thank you again for that warm introduction, and thanks to each one of you for being here. I know when we plan things, last night's always a tough night because a lot of people head for home, but you have really come in good numbers tonight, and I thank you so very much for that. When you were talking about this following that was coming every night, I did have the feeling that maybe you were going to check it out and see if I could get it right once. And that was when you were back again this evening. Can I have a little fun with you tonight? I mean, just start off with a little silly fun. And at the beginning of what I say tonight, don't take me too seriously, okay? I want to say that up at the beginning. We've been talking about this paragon of Welsh virtue who is my father. And I love to tell a story. And you heard that word, right? A story. And because what I said to you last night about trying to tell the truth, I'm trying to give you some warning at this moment. Okay, and are you hearing what I'm saying? But when I was a little boy in this story, it was Boxing Day, the day after Christmas. And we are in northern Alberta in this story. And it's beginning to snow. It's one of those beautiful winter days. And my dad says to me, let's go for a walk in the woods. And so Dad had this huge parka. It was, I remember it with such affection and such warmth. It sort of was him. Big furry hood, fur around the sleeves here, and huge big pockets. And we begin to walk out into the woods. It is one of those days when, you can actually hear the snowfall. You know those days when everything is so quiet that you can literally hear the snowfall. And as a little boy, I can remember walking in this story, holding his hand and walking out into the woods. And suddenly, there in front of us, there was a deer. And the deer was standing looking at us. And my dad just hushed and said, stand still. Well, I stood as still as a little guy can stand. But my dad was perfectly still. And what was amazing was that deer did not run. It looked at us, and then it began to slowly move towards Dad. And I'd never in my life seen anything like it. Dad had cubes of sugar in the pocket of his parka. And this animal moved and licked at the sugar. My dad looked at me and he said, son, don't ever forget this. There's nothing nicer on the day after Christmas than having a little dough in your pocket. Now, I warned you. No, it didn't happen. It's just a story. I say that because sometimes if I get carried away when I tell that story and don't forewarn people, they can actually get upset at you for having let them down the line with a story about your part. Well, actually, we're going to talk about a little dough in the pocket. We've come through a number of issues on stewardship. And tonight is going to be, more than anything, a kind of a summary, a kind of a bringing to a conclusion what we have done. There are 3 or 4 separate pieces that I'd like to do tonight, and I hope we're able to present them in a way that there is some logic to them and that they follow some kind of a basic pattern. I want to begin by reminding us of our basic theme, which is that we are servants and stewards of the grace of God. Servants of Christ, stewards of the mysteries. I want us to go back to that first theme and not to allow it to slip away from our consciousness. I was looking at my Bible just before I stood up and reading again a powerfully fascinating story. The story of Jesus immediately prior to the upper room experience. One of the reasons this story interests me so much is that I can remember on a trip to Jerusalem, going with a group of people, and we went to all of the sites, all of the places, and we had a kind of a covenant with one another that any time we were at one of those places, anybody that would like to could read the scripture passage that was connected with that particular spot. Now, you do have to be a little careful when you go to Israel. People get what is called spot fever. Spot fever is the feeling that here is where that happened. Remember on that trip there we had some Roman Catholics, and they picked up some soil, and they were saying, this is sacred soil. That misses the point. The point is that what happened there makes every piece of earth sacred. That the whole of our earth has been blessed by the presence of the living Christ. But this particular day, we were in one of the places that is said to be perhaps the place of the upper room experience. And one of our group read the passage from the Gospel of Luke about how Jesus said, go out into the streets and find a man who's carrying a jug of water on his head and tell him that the master has need of him. And when we went out to the bus, our Jewish Israeli guide said, there's something really wrong with that story. And I said, well, what is it? He said, no man would carry a jug of water on his head. Now, pardon the sexism in that particular culture, that was a woman's task. Or, if not a woman, it certainly was a slave's task. No man would do that. And I thought to myself, how like Jesus to look for somebody who would be willing to do the work of a servant. How like him to find that person. So we are servants and stewards of the mysteries. And I don't want us this last night to forget that as the flow. And so many of the things we've been talking about in the various arenas of this series. And by the way, I do want to say, it's been my joy to work with so many others. I leave Acadia with a very profound respect for your Doctor of Ministry program. Rick and Lionel, both persons who have been through that program, have made major contributions in terms of some of the plenary sessions that we have had. And I think in many ways it's a great tribute to the quality of the work that is being done here. So to be a part of this team has been a great, great blessing to me. But underlying all of those workshops and all of those plenary sessions, servants of Christ, stewards of the mysteries. I want to begin tonight by talking about 5 basic stewardship realities. They're not wildly profound, but they are very straightforward. And I think they are the kind of thing that we need to keep in mind as we look at the stewardship work that God has given us to do. We really began here and made this point on the first night that everything is from God. The earth is the Lord's. It's never ours. It is always God's. And the things that we claim to be ours are ours only for a while. We are at best interims. It is trusted to us but for a time. So the first basic fundamental stewardship reality is that everything is from God. The second stewardship reality is that nobody has everything. Okay? Nobody has everything. And I'm not talking now only in monetary terms. I'm talking in terms of spiritual gifts and of abilities. I'm talking of the variety of ways by which God blesses us. No one person could really do ministry alone. We need others. That is why the foundational image of the church in the Bible is the body of Christ. No one part can make up the whole body. And no matter how gifted we are, or no matter how much the resources that we have, we cannot do this alone. No one has everything. The third simple stewardship basic thing to say is that on the other hand, no one has nothing. Everyone is gifted. There is no such thing as an ungifted Christian. God has given the gifts of the Spirit to every Christian. And when we come into ministry, we need each other desperately, no matter how good you are, no matter how gifted you are. You need even others, as I need others, to fulfill fully the gifts that God has given to me. And that's why there can be no arrogance about our gifts. And no arrogance about what God has given to them, because they are God's gifts. Sometimes the gifts that we think of as being not that important or not that significant can be powerfully important as we learn to use them wisely and well in the life and ministry of the church. In a congregation that I was a member of for a while, we had a problem. We couldn't find a greeter at the door of the church. Nobody would do it. And there was a guy in the church whose name was Alan, and he was a great accountant. He didn't do well with people, but he was great with numbers. He's the kind of a person every church needs to help keep those numbers straight. But Alan was also the kind of a guy who would do sort of any, he wouldn't say no. And so Alan was the only one in the church who would say that he would stand at the door of the church and greet people. And it was almost painful. Because as you'd come to church on Sunday morning, Alan would really try. But his personality was such that it was really hard for him. And you'd get kind of this little hand that would move out, and bless his heart, he'd say, I'm glad you're here. But it lacked warmth and feeling and all that kind of thing. Well, in the life of that church, we had a little Discover Your Gifts program. There was a woman in the congregation by the name of Pat. And Pat, when she went through the gifts, the way she put it was, I discovered that my name was in the Bible. And the way her name was in the Bible was that Pat had the gift of hospitality. And she was a very hospitable woman. Loved having people over to her house. Was very at ease with people. And you would think this is such a tiny thing. But Pat, after she discovered her gift, said, I'll greet at the door of the church. What a difference it was to go into that church. Now, she was a little aggressive at first. We had to calm her down just a little bit. It's true, but she didn't think she had anything to offer. And she failed to understand that no one has nothing. Every Christian is gifted. And the stewardship ministry has got to be a ministry in which we focus not just on money and not just on time, but on abilities, on gifts. And not only to discover those gifts, but to develop them and to deploy them in the life and in the ministry of the church. The fourth of my 5 realities is that you alone will decide how to use what God has given. It's a choice that you and I are going to make. God doesn't force this choice on us. This is true of our resources, this is true of our time, this is true of our use of our abilities. It is the decision of every individual Christian how you are going to use or not use the gifts that God has given. The last one of the remarks that I would like to suggest to you is that how you use that gift will shape you. You will in fact become, in your Christian experience, the way that you use the gift that God has given. In many cases, if you do not use the gift, you will lose it. And your life will in many ways be decided by the way that you respond to the invitation of God in full stewardship. I can't let this night go by without a strong reminder that stewardship must be whole life. Stewardship cannot be confined into any categories. Even the little 3 T's that are most often used, time, treasure, and talent, is a trivialization of the idea of stewardship. Stewardship is everything that we are and everything that we have. And how we use that in relationship to our calling in God. And if we go back and do as the church has done over a long period of time, make money the whole focus of stewardship, then we are in many ways trivializing this great and important message. In fact, what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to just take a moment or two and talk about the relationship between stewardship and money. Talk about the relationship between stewardship and money. There are some, and I'll try to illustrate this with my hands. If this hand over here, this little fist over here, is stewardship, and this fist over here is money, there are some people who would say that this is the relationship. Stewardship is one thing, and money is another thing. There are others who would say, no, that's not the way they work together. The way they work together is like this. They sort of overlap. Stewardship is in one area, and then money is over here, and the two kind of overlap just a little bit. I don't think that catches it either. There's a third way of looking at it. And the third way of looking at it is to say, this is money, right? And this is stewardship. So stewardship is really kind of a subcategory of the Christian teaching about money. That's not it either. Fourth, the way that it is that money, in fact, is a part of, not the whole of, but a part of the Christian teaching about stewardship. So that if all that you talk about is money, you have not caught the fullness of stewardship. But on the other hand, if you do not talk about money, you have not talked about the fullness of the Christian understanding of what it means to be a steward. So the relationship is the one in which money is the subcategory under the overarching idea or response of Christian stewardship. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the issues around money. I'm going to begin by confessing to you that money is a difficult subject to talk about in the life of the church. North Americans do not like to talk about money. And if you begin to talk about money, you are going to find that people in many, many ways will begin to sort of grumble and talk and all that sort of thing. And it's one of the reasons why in seminars like this, I love to encourage the lay people who are present to be encouragers of their pastors to speak wisely and well about the issue of money. Because anytime there is a sermon on money, somebody at the door of the church is saying that's all we ever hear around here. And it needs somebody else to come behind afterwards and say, Pastor, thank you for that. We really needed that good word. I think one of the reasons why we are so loath to talk about money, and I explained this in one of the earlier lectures, is because of the deep reality that money in so many ways stands for the symbol of the age in which we live, and that when that symbol comes in confrontation with the cross, that the spirit of the age, which is get, clashes with the spirit of the Christ, which is give. If you want to think of it in a way that we did not symbolize the other night, and I'm certainly using my hands tonight, but let the closed fist be the symbol of the age. Get it, grab it, hold it, don't let it go. Just think for a minute of trying to sit with the person next to you and hold fists. You can't do it. You can't create community that way. The sign of the symbol, the sign and symbol of the steward is the open hand. See how easy it is to form community with the open hand. Actually, the reality of it is that someone can't give you anything if you're living with clenched fists. The only way you can receive is to open your hand and to be open to the goodness of God. So that clash is very much a part of this. But I would encourage pastors, even although there is pressure against speaking in relationship to money, I would urge you to do it. But I would urge you not always to begin the talk about money with talking about giving. Try to take an approach of some of the things that we've been doing this week. Number one, be biblical. People really do not care about what your philosophy of economics is. But I think they care deeply about how, under God's rule, they are to use the resources that have been given to them. So make sure that you are biblical. Number two, lighten up. When you preach about money, help people to learn to laugh at it. One of the problems about money in this society is everybody's so uptight about it. They're so nervous about talking about it. The minute you say it, blood pressures go up all over the place. Try and help them to calm down a little bit, just to loosen up. I mean, did you hear about the dear saint who ran out of food in her cupboard, and like Daniel of old, she went to the window and opened it. And she prayed, "Dear Lord, you've always met my needs. You know my need today. You know that the cupboard's bare." What she didn't know was that her next door neighbor, who was kind of a nasty old guy, who was sort of the village atheist, was down working on some bushes and heard every word she prayed. And the little guy thought, "I'm going to get her. I'm going to get her this time." So he raced down to the corner store and he bought bundles of groceries, bags of groceries. He raced back to her house and he put them right on the front door, and he pushed the button, and then he raced and hid behind some more bushes. She opened the door, looked down, and said, "Dear Lord, you are so incredibly good. It was an hour ago that I prayed about my need, and you always..." And all of a sudden, he popped up from behind the bush. "God didn't do that, I did." She paid no attention. She kept right on praying. "God, you always provide every need. I can't believe how marvelous..." No, he said, "God didn't do that, I did. Look, here's the receipt from the cash register." She said, "God, you're so good. You always meet every need. You meet it with such incredible abundance. And this time, you even got the devil to foot the bill." Or you can lighten up on the subject of money. People don't laugh at it anymore. Do you remember Jack Benny? Jack Benny made a comic career out of poking fun at money. But if you listen to comedians these days, there's very little humor that's focused on the subject of money, because we're too uptight about it. Learn to treat it like the stuff that it is. Help people to laugh about it. Be biblical. Be light. Lighten up with the subject. Teach people foundational stuff. Help people to learn again percentage giving and the tithe. That's a great learning mode for people in learning how to handle their money. Teach the 10-10-80, 10% to God, 10% to savings, and learn to live on 80%. And I think I've said to you a couple of times, but I want to say it again so that it gets underlined. Teach children about money. Children are the targets of the advertisers of the consumer culture. They're out after kids. And it's our responsibility in Christ to help our children to be able to learn to have wise and good attitudes around the subject of money. You know, all of this, approach it. Help people to learn how to get out of debt. How to overcome the need for instant gratification. If you begin to do that in a sound way, you're talking about the subject that's on the minds of most people. People think more about problems related to money than any other single thing. The most important cause, the number one cause of divorce, and one of you told me that this is in Canada as well as in the United States, is misunderstanding around the issue of money. And if the church is quiet on this subject, if we give in to the temptation not to say anything, who will speak for God? I had fun the other day. I was talking to someone and he was sharing with me the way that we respond in our churches sort of a reality moment in terms of the kinds of hymns that we sing. One of the first hymns was, "Oh, How I Like Jesus." And the second hymn was, "I Surrender Some." And the third was, "Give of What's Left to the Master." And the fourth was, "He is quite a bit to me." And the next one is, "Fill my spoon, Lord." And then the male chorus sings, "Take my wife and let her be." Because I've said so much about the tithe, I want to move on. And I want to focus our time for the next few minutes on a different area of the idea of giving and the idea of handling our money. I have for a long time been deeply concerned about the offertory in the worship service. About the offering. How we do that. See, I believe that giving is an act of worship and praise. That fundamentally giving doesn't have its roots connected directly with the church's budgets. Giving has to do with my heart and the Lord. And that it is a substantial expression of praise to God. So that when we are in church, we praise God with our songs. We praise God with our words. The pastor praises God with the disciplined presentation of the word. But together we all substantially praise God as we offer our gifts to God in worship. And somehow, especially in many of our white or Anglo churches, we have lost that. I wish that you could go to a place like Zaire and experience an offering where people have next to nothing and where what is brought forward might simply be a handful of grain or a little handful of manioc. But the offering is a great celebration. It is a dance before the Lord. And the music is played, and the people sing, and there is joy and power in the worship of that moment. That same thing, interestingly enough, happens in many of our African American churches. I was in one of the churches in San Francisco, of Allen Temple, one of the great churches actually it's in Oakland, across the bay. But what happens is that all of a sudden in the middle of the service, someone stands up and in a loud voice says, "It's giving time." And the place erupts in praise. And they follow those patterns. Now, I'm not suggesting, I know the cultural differences are here, and I'm not suggesting that you go home next week and try and organize a great parade around the offering. But you know, I was in one of our churches within the last couple of months, and I was listening to the music. And I was watching the people. I don't know how come, but that organist picked a piece that sounded like a funeral dirge. It was kind of heavy on the pedals and the organ, and it went bom, bom, bom. And I looked at the faces of the people. And honestly, they looked like they were in the waiting room of the dentist office. There was no sense that this had anything to do with worship and praise. It was kind of the commercial break in the middle of the program. This was the way that we paid the bills. And I want to challenge you. Those of you who are pastors and those of you who are musicians, for the glory of God, work on that. Take it as one of your challenges of this series of lectures. To be intentional about helping your people realize that that's not the commercial break to pay the bills. That is a moment of substantial praise to God. In Reformed worship, the offering was the last element of worship because it was seen as the response to the preaching of the Word. That's pretty significant stuff. But we have tended to trivialize that. And I don't necessarily have 3 easy ways to do it. But I do want to encourage the creative thinkers amongst you not to treat the offering lightly. You will do much for your stewardship and for your worship if we can reclaim those moments of worship for what they were intended to be. Now, I want to focus on a New Testament offering for just a few minutes. Because I have found over the last couple of years that studying, what's often called the Great Collection, is a fascinating endeavor. The Great Collection was the offering that the Apostle Paul took, and it looks as if he took it nearly all his ministry. For the saints in Jerusalem, for the poor in Jerusalem, and at times it's associated with the famine in Jerusalem, and at other times it's just for the poor in Jerusalem. But you remember that in Galatians, the 2nd chapter, they had a meeting of the leaders. There was a moment when the church was facing the whole issue of should the gospel be preached to the Gentiles? And there was kind of this bargain that was struck. Now, it didn't necessarily always work out the way it was planned then, but the bargain was that Peter would be the one who would be seen as apostle to the circumcised, to the Jews, and that Paul would be recognized as an apostle to the Gentiles. Now, you know what? This council didn't end the problem. It's often called the Jerusalem Council. This problem followed Paul for a long time. But at the end of the description of that agreement, the one other thing that Paul agrees to do is to take up an offering for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And Paul ends up saying, that was no problem for me because I wanted to do that anyway. Now what's really fascinating is that Paul takes that offering from that day almost through the rest of his ministry. Certainly Romans is one of the last books, probably the last book. And he's still talking about it in the book of Romans. And what's so amazing about it is, when you think about it, it was the church in Jerusalem that gave Paul but many of his major headaches. These were the people that sent folk around saying, now there's a little bit more of the gospel that he didn't tell you. Or that questioned his message. Now, without question, the temptation of contemporary Christians would be to say, do that one more time and I'll cut off your funding. You do that one more time and I won't give you another $1. There is in us a kind of a tendency to what I call vengeful stewardship. Vengeful stewardship is if you don't do it my way, I won't give you anything. The Apostle Paul is an amazing example of a Christ-like servant stewardship. Because he never ceases to talk about this offering and to try to collect it and to try to make sure that money is sent so that the poor saints in Jerusalem can be blessed by this offering from the other churches. Now, if you really want to see Paul as a kind of a basic fundraiser, read the 8th and the 9th chapters of the book of 2 Corinthians. Because in 2 Corinthians he goes into great detail. And tonight we're not going to work our way through that. Although you will find that to be a very interesting and very powerful passage of Scripture. But what I want to do with you tonight, is to look at 5 different words that the Apostle Paul uses to describe this offering. Because I think these are powerful words. And they help us to begin to see in depth what the stewardship of our money can be all about. For example, in the 8th chapter of 2 Corinthians, Paul calls this offering a charis. It is grace. It is grace-filled. You could almost say that the offering is a charismatic moment in worship. The actual word that's used for the offering is the word charis, or grace. I think that grace is a powerfully important word in thinking about our stewardship and in thinking about giving. Giving has to be rooted in our response to God's grace and in the generosity that flows from that. For example, I've always loved the first tithing story in the Bible, which is the story of Abraham. You remember, that is a pre-law story. It's before Moses. So this was not something that was codified and that he had to do. But Abraham had won a battle. He had actually rescued his family members who had been taken by enemies. He had very few in number in comparison with his enemies, but he won. And I suppose, according to the time, took the booty from this victory and was on his way home when he met someone by the name of Melchizedek. And in what seems to be a kind of an atmosphere of worship, for it talks about breaking bread, Abraham gives to Melchizedek the tenth. It is sheer generosity in response to grace. And more, that's what our stewardship needs to be. Growing generosity in response to the grace that God has given us in Jesus Christ. That's not the only word that Paul uses. He uses the word diakonia. The offering is a service. Diakonia is a word, obviously, from which our word deacon comes. But the idea is that the gift is itself a form of service to God. It is a way by which ministry can be accomplished. It's almost like a miracle to me. When sometimes you have the opportunity, say, of visiting an international field, and you see there doctors who are caring for the ill, when you see agriculturalists who are helping farmers to learn how to grow crops that will feed the people. In many ways, that service is a kind of a miracle. I would make a terrible farmer. Probably would make a worse surgeon. I could never do that. But by the miracle of mission, I can, because it is a diakonia, I can give a gift that can be transformed by God's grace and produce what I could never do by myself. That service happens internationally. That service happens close at home. When your local church reaches out to find the needs of the people in your community, when you feed the hungry, when you shelter the homeless, when you counsel those who are in need of a wise listener and of a wise counselor in their lives. It's the miracle of how the dollar can be transformed, because in fact it is a diakonia. One of the other Greek words that's used in this passage is a liturgia. That's the word from which we get our word litany. That's the work of the people of God. Why do you work? Well, I work so that my family will be able to have the necessities of life. I work so that we can have a home. I work so that we do some of the things we want to do. Do you ever stop to think that you work so that God's kingdom can be established and can grow? You stop to think that your work makes it possible for mission and ministry? It is the work of the people of God. It's no wonder this idea of offering should hold such a high and noble sense as we look at a service of worship. It is a eulogia. It is an expression of worship. Don't ever forget that that offering is a moment of worship. I've said that earlier this evening, so that there will be that sense that it is a way by which we praise God. It helps to bring discipline, that word that we were using this morning, and it helps to bring meaning to the idea of praise. Because when praise is just words, it can easily be overstatement. By understanding that the giving is itself an act of praise, that can bring balance and strength to the understanding of the way by which we worship God. And the last of these words that I want to point out to you is the word koinonia. The offering in the 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians is called a koinonia. It is an expression of fellowship. It is an expression of the community of faith, of what it means to be a sister or a brother in Jesus Christ. Paul talks about that when he talks about how their giving to the saints in Jerusalem helps to create a marvelous sense of koinonia between Corinth and between Jerusalem. And that happens to us as we give. We are a part of a bigger fellowship. We connect with the church, not just in Jerusalem, but Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So, these great and extraordinarily powerful words, I hope are ways by which we can begin to see the way by which we can elevate our understanding of giving. And to see it as so much more than just paying the church's bills. But begin to see it as discipline, discipleship, response. Or whole life stewardship before the Lord. But when you talk about giving, you really threaten people in our time. They get nervous. They get afraid about all kinds of things. Another, just before we finish, silly story. There's a story about a guy who had a weird sort of a verbal quirk. He was so nervous about money. So nervous that he couldn't say the word once. Every time he said the word money, he had to say it 3 times. So he'd say like to his wife, honey, can you give me some money, 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 and I'll go to the store. Or he'd say to his kids, do you have enough money, money, money to get home? Or he'd go to the bank and he'd say to the teller, I need to withdraw some money, money, money out of my account. And finally, he said, you've got to get help with this. This is too much. So he goes to a therapist, and the therapist says to him, you really do have a problem. But he says it's not that big a problem. So we can handle it. We'll handle it real easily. He said the problem is you're nervous about money. And what we have to do is to provide a stronger sentiment in your life. So keep on saying money the way you are for this next week. But do me a favor, and every time you say the word love, say it 3 times. That's your homework for this week. And the old guy says, Doc, that's the best therapy I could ever want. Because if there's anything I love, it's money, money, money. Well, go back with me to the beginning. That's the question. What do we really love? Or put it just a slightly different way. What do we really trust? Because the world around us tells us that what we can trust in are the bank accounts, are the stock markets, are the things we own, are the things we possess, are the things we can touch, are the things that we can handle, the things that we can have. But you know the truth? Those things are not trustworthy. Did you follow the psyche of the stock market in the last couple of months? Did you know the panic that was in people's hearts when the stock market in Hong Kong dropped? Is that all there is to put our trust in? Or is there a sense in which you can put your trust in one who will stick closer than a brother? I started, remember, by telling you about a young preacher who was very nervous about preaching from that text, "Consider the lilies of the fields," and about how when I was younger, I actually got up and couldn't preach that sermon. I'm at the other end of my career now, and I can bear witness. I could preach that sermon now with great certainty, because over a lifetime of ministry, I have watched the wonder of the providence of God. Not at all because of anything that I did or any worth that is in us, but somehow in His marvelous grace. We've never been rich, but we have always had enough. In fact, we have had more than enough. And our problem, although by standards we are not rich, has been how to handle the more than the enough. The bottom line is that given the choice between trusting God and the currency, I think you've got every right to tell your people that God is a far surer thing. My closing story for you. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed being with you this week. Maybe it's because my roots are here. I've always felt such a deep sense of debt to Canadian Baptists. Because whatever my life is, it was in the warm and healthy fellowship of Canadian Baptists that this person got started. And it was within this family of faith that I felt the call into the ministry. And it's one reason why I'm so glad to be able to come back and share in whatever way I can in a series of lectures like this. It's been fun remembering my mom and dad. And talk more about my dad, but I'm going to tell you a little story about my mother. When my mother, who was born in Newfoundland, was a very young girl, her father was a sea captain, and this, by the way, is not a story. You can trust this one. Her father went down to sea, and her mother developed a great fear lest my mother's brothers should go to sea. And so, bless her heart, that strong Newfoundland woman, my grandmother, took her family to Borden, Saskatchewan. Took the family to Borden, Saskatchewan and began a new life. It ended up in Calgary, where my mother met my dad, and the rest of the story continues. But one of the effects that had on my mother was that my mother hated water. She still hates water. Now, that affected me as a child only in this way. I was lucky to get a Saturday night bath. And you'd better believe I was not allowed to go swimming. I mean, that was just not even thinkable. So that when in school, the school kids would go and take swimming lessons, as they did in Alberta in those days, I took a note that excused me, because my mother did not want me near water. Well, you know, the unfortunate thing is that kids are kids. And at a given point, I decided there were a group of guys who lived in Grand Prairie. They were going down to a backwater in the Wapiti River, and they were going to go swimming. So I was going to go with them. Of course I didn't tell her. And away we went. Now, I had never been swimming before. But I knew how to follow the leader. And I sort of watched what everybody else did, and I did the same thing. And they proceeded to get their swimming suits on and then to go jump off a little cliff into the backwater, into probably about 10 or 12 feet of water. Well, I did the same as they did. And to this day, I can remember the fear. In fact, even as I tell you the story, I can almost relive it, of trying to climb to the top of that water and being so helpless and flailing at the water. I mean, we are not talking about mild gestures here. We are talking about life struggle and kicking and moving my arms and throwing back my head, and all the time just simply sinking. And had it not been for a friend, a guy by the name of Ron Neufeld, who was aware enough of what was going on to recognize that I was in trouble, and who himself was an A1 swimmer, and went down and was able to grab me and help push me to the top. You know, that could have been the end of my life. Well, after I left home, you know, every individual needs to declare their own independence. And for me, it may seem like a very small and silly thing, but sort of one of the ways of severing the bond between my parents and myself was that I went to learn how to swim. Went down to the YMCA. And what they taught me there was that if I took a deep breath, that I could lie back on the water, and that there was within the water a power that would keep me afloat. And when I learned how to do that, and to breathe, and to feel the incredible buoyant grace of that water, I often thought of the moments of the flailing, and the struggling, and the kicking, and the grasping. That, for me, has become a kind of a lifetime metaphor for what it means to trust God. That in the last analysis, I don't have to do it by myself. In fact, I can't do it by myself. Because for all of my smartness, or for all of my activity, or for all of my busyness, without the buoyant grace of God, I'll sink. Whenever I'm talking about stewardship, and I hear people who are so afraid that if they let go, or if they give more, or if they sacrifice beyond a given point, I keep wanting to say, take a deep breath, lean back, and know that you will be supported by the everlasting arm. Trust is a must. If you don't trust God, you've got to trust something. Why in the world would you trust anything else when you can trust in the Lord with all your heart? And lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. God bless you. Servants,